Hello. Our topic this week is to explore how the New Deal, the collection of reforms and agencies created by Franklin Roosevelt's administration, greatly expanded the role and the scope of the federal government in the United States. The New Deal was brought about by the massive economic catastrophe that was the Great Depression. The Depression forced the U.S. to confront what the role of the federal government would be in the face of a major crisis. Was it to remain laissez-faire, hands-off, and let businesses correct the economic downfall themselves? The same banking and business interests that were responsible for creating the Great Depression? Not likely. The New Deal forced open spaces for the federal government to assert itself into. Through huge deficit spending and the creation of social welfare, the New Deal was the most significant change to the size and authority of the federal government in U.S. history. The big picture here to understand is during the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt and his administration responded to the mass unemployment and social upheavals of the Great Depression by transforming the U.S. into a limited welfare state and redefining the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. The New Deal was created in response to the Great Depression that began at the end of 1929. But what brought about the Great Depression, the absolute worst disaster in global economic history? First, we have to recognize that periods of economic downturns and recessions are, and always had been, a common occurrence in U.S. history. Every 20 years or so, the economy had gone through a period of contraction. But in each of these episodes, the duration was short, and compared to the Great Depression, the economy's descent was much shallower. What caused this Great Depression was not one single event, but instead a totality of crisis, natural to the fabric of a capitalist economy itself. First came the stock market crash in October of 1929. But less than 10% of Americans even had money invested in the stock market. So how could one development like this lead to a nationwide and global economic meltdown? It's important to think of the totality of an economic system. Each part of the economy is related to another. When one falls, it does not fall in isolation. The vast, uneven distribution of wealth was another contributing factor to the Depression. The wealthiest held all of the wealth. Therefore, their fall was greatly protected compared to the plight of working peoples during the Depression. The top 5% of richest Americans received over 33% of all income. So once demand for their products declined, businesses laid off workers. Overproduction and underconsumption were twin faces of another part of the Depression. American industries were producing too many goods, and when the demand dried up, warehouses were full, and workers were laid off. And in turn, people who are without work will not consume commodities at the same rate, thus leading to more factories having to lay off its workforce. The government's economic policies of the 1920s were a major part of this problem as well. The laissez-faire capitalist approach of the 1920s American government had very little regulatory power over finance and industry. When left to their own greedy devices, these capitalist interests will make risky investments. When these failed, banks too failed, and people's entire savings accounts disappeared. For American farmers, the Great Depression came early. The 1920s saw a poor farm economy overall. The prosperity of the 20s never reached farmers. Problems included overproduction, high debt, low crop prices, and severe drought. Things were made worse when nations implemented extreme protectionist tariff policies in response to the oncoming depression, thus severely limiting global trade, ensuring that the depression would spread. And to make matters worse, severe drought and windstorms wreaked havoc on the overfarmed, dust bowl soil of the Midwestern states. So what about the president at this time? President Herbert Hoover in the beginning of the Depression. President Hoover did not believe it was the job of the federal government to provide relief in times of depression. America had gone through panics before, recessions before, and they always ended. So Hoover believed that this would be the same. One thing he did do was he passed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which gave federal funds to help railroads, banks, and insurance companies. This is kind of like the trickle-down philosophy, the idea that if government gives subsidies to the wealthiest, then money will trickle down to all of the rest of the people. Of course, this is a lie. What really ended Hoover's presidency and ensured that he would not win re-election in 1932 was the treatment of the bonus army. Thousands of unemployed veterans from World War I marched to Washington, D.C., demanding that the federal government pay out their promised bonuses that were promised to the families of these veterans after they died. Hoover ordered the army to drive the veterans off of the lawn of the U.S. Capitol. This ruined Hoover's chances at re-election. And in 1932, a new president was elected, the Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt. He will implement what's become known as the New Deal. FDR expanded the size of the federal government and altered the scope of its operations, greatly enlarging presidential powers. His New Deal philosophy focused on 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Providing relief for people in need, providing federal government intervention to recover the economy and get it moving again, and to create a system of reforms and government agencies whose task it would be to ensure that a depression like this would never happen again. In the first 100 days of his presidency, he passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, the National Recovery Administration, etc. FDR and Congress passed more legislation in the first 100 days than any other presidential administration before or since. Let's look at the first R of the New Deal, relief. Here are 3 examples of New Deal programs designed to provide relief to people in need. The first was the Federal Emergency Relief Act. This gave federal financial aid to states to support local relief programs for the destitute. But apart from this, Roosevelt and New Dealers did not believe in just directly giving money to people. Instead, they believed that people needed to be put back to work, and the employer would be the federal government. So the government would spend massive amounts of money, known as deficit spending, in order to put people to work building things for the country. And some examples of that were the Civilian Conservation Corps, where unemployed and unskilled young men would be paid by the government to work on rural and park improvements. Or the Public Works Administration, where the federal government would pay private companies to build large-scale infrastructure projects that states needed. Many bridges, museums, hospitals, and schools were built this way. The second R in the New Deal is recovery, how to get the economy moving again. Here are 2 examples. The National Industrial Recovery Act established codes of fair practice for individual industries in order to promote industrial growth. What we see here is the federal government at first becoming a partner and then often becoming a regulating body and a boss to businesses. The NIRA also created the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, which required government-based industrial regulation. The governments would not be laissez-faire, hands-off with industries anymore. Government would be the boss of business. Some of the rules we can see as being very pro-union and included defining labor standards and raising the wages of workers and allowing workers to join unions. The final R is reform. Here are 3 examples of reforms that were created by the New Deal to try to prevent a further depression from happening again. Most famously is the Social Security Act. This created a national system of pensions and unemployment insurance and aid to mothers with children, for the elderly, and for the disabled. There was also the Wagner Act, which protected the right of collective bargaining for labor unions. Another one is the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission. This insured bank deposits against a bank failure. So if a bank were to fail, the people's money, their savings, would not disappear. It would be insured by the federal government. Politics in the New Deal. The New Deal was hugely popular. Franklin Roosevelt will win 4 presidential elections in a row. But that doesn't mean the New Deal did not have a lot of criticism. Franklin Roosevelt was criticized from both the right and from the left. From the right, from the conservative side, from the Republican side, conservatives claimed the New Deal gave the federal government too much power and cost too much. Well, it did give more power to the federal government than ever before, and it did cost more than anything before, but it was rooted in an economic philosophy called Keynesian by the British economist John Maynard Keynes, which said that governments should spend more money. They should go into deficit spending in order to get the country out of the Depression. So it was designed to cost too much. Some even said that the New Deal bordered on socialism, this dirty word in American history. That's untrue. Although one of the key parts of the New Deal we can definitely see a socialist influence in, the idea of Social Security, and that out of our payroll checks, we provide payments in Social Security, which goes to help the elderly, the disabled, etc. That's similar to a socialist philosophy. But the New Deal was not a socialist philosophy. The New Deal at its core was a way to save capitalism. And thus, the New Deal was also criticized from the left. Socialists and communists criticized the New Deal for doing too much for businesses, but too little for the actual working poor. And it's also true that many of the government programs discriminated against minority groups. Though, during this time period, we see popular front politics in which many communists and socialists actually join in with the New Deal coalition and help to push Franklin Roosevelt farther to the left. And so importantly, we have to look at political party shifts during the New Deal as well, and because of the New Deal. First off, we have our 2 major parties still, the Democrat Party and the Republican Party. But things really changed in the 1930s. Let's start with the Democrats. The Democrats believed in New Deal liberalism, that the federal government should play an active role in relief, recovery, and reform in the economy. Thus, the size and cost of government should expand. This wins a lot of support from labor unions, who won many rights from the New Deal. It also won support from Black people, from academics and universities, and from urban working class communities. The Republican Party opposed these large governmental efforts and regulations to create social change. The Republican Party believed that the economy worked best under the laissez-faire method, where government was a partner with business. Government should not be a referee for business, according to the conservatives. Therefore, recovery should take place at local levels and state levels, but not from the federal government. The Republican Party was supported by the business community and also by cultural conservatives. Finally, what about the Socialist Party, which had rose to prominence, though never winning the White House, but winning many seats during the Progressive era? Well, many socialists abandoned the Socialist Party in the 1932 election and voted for Franklin Roosevelt. The party never recovered its membership. Most socialists joined into this New Deal coalition led by the New Dealers. So let's reflect on change during the era of the Great Depression and the New Deal, roughly from 1929 to 1939. Here are 3 things we need to understand. The New Deal transformed classical liberal theory into New Deal liberalism, where the federal government greatly expands its size and scope to address economic and social issues through the policies of deficit spending and providing social welfare to the people. This New Deal liberalism will establish itself as the dominant political thinking for decades. Franklin Roosevelt will win 4 elections in a row. After that, his Vice President Harry Truman will win another election. After that, a Republican, Dwight Eisenhower, will win 2 elections, but in his governing philosophy, we definitely see the influence of the New Deal. In fact, the New Deal liberalism will last all the way up until the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. So we're talking about 50 years of political dominance here. The New Deal left a legacy of reforms and federal regulatory agencies and fostered a long-term political realignment in which many ethnic groups, African Americans, working class communities, labor unions, all identified with the Democratic Party. And the language and philosophy of FDR and the New Deal greatly altered the term freedom in American society. Freedom did not mean freedom to do this, but to Roosevelt it meant freedom from fear, freedom from need, etc.